in terms of the tax cuts, in terms of the tariffs, in terms of all these things, they're not actually, when you model them out, promoting any significant increase in GDP, any significant increase in jobs. And then, of course, who even knows if the projections, which, tend to be relatively fair, but anything can happen in terms of the economy. So it could be worse than what's even projected. It could be better, but even then, would it really change the trajectory of the economy in the United States? I don't think so whatsoever. And then you also look at a lot of Trump's policies. I mean, a huge amount of Trump's policies are about reducing people's income.
Welcome to the Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Fiona Edwards and my co-host is Ileana Chan. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. If you do like what you hear, please do subscribe to this channel, click on the bell to receive a notification when we release new episodes. And of course, if you do appreciate our work, you can support us by becoming a member of Empire Watch on Patreon, and the link is in the description of this episode below.
We are so excited that joining us today is Eugene Puryear. I probably butchered your name. I apologize, even though I hear it every week on Breakthrough News. Eugene is an American journalist, a writer, activist, and host of Breakthrough News. He is the author of Shackled and Chained: Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America. He regularly reports on the anti-colonial struggle on the African continent. Eugene, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on our show.
Listen, it's an honor. It's great to be here. You do great work. There's been a great roster so far, so I'm just glad to be added to the lineup.
Well, no, we're really honored to have you on, Eugene, and we really appreciate all the work you're doing to, really hit back against the US war drive and kind of expose all the propaganda that's going on. So just to start with, it's 2025. Donald Trump has returned to the White House for a second term as president of the United States, promising to make America great again. I'm not sure when it was great, but anyway, so obviously as a powerful figurehead of the global far right, Trump's return to the presidency is really threatening to reinforce reactionary sentiment in the United States and internationally. And recently we've had a taste of that in Britain. We've got Elon Musk, who of course is a key figure in the new Trump administration, intervening in British politics to whip up racism and propagate far right conspiracy theories under the guise of tackling so-called Muslim grooming gangs, which obviously is a racist concept. And then when you look in the United States, we've got the atmosphere of repression, censorship, and witch hunts, which has already become quite normalized actually under the Biden administration. And that seems to be ratcheting up now. So Breakthrough News, where you're at, is amongst those challenging the US warmongering agenda that is now in the crosshairs. So we have members of Congress targeting Breakthrough News for your consistent coverage, for example, on Palestine, and they're calling for you to be investigated in the hope that they can silence you. So, Eugene, with Trump back in office, do you believe there will be a further escalation of repression, a similar trajectory? What changes do you think Trump's administration will bring?
It's a great question. I mean, I think in some ways, as you mentioned the question, there's a sort of similarity in the trajectory here from the Biden administration. And I would argue really there's been sort of maybe the Occupy movement might be the right way to look at this, but maybe more directly, I think, since what we saw in Ferguson, an arc of an increase in repression overall in the country. And I think that is a direct result of what is happening in terms of the ruling elite who are running the country. I mean, I think whether we're talking about climate change, poverty, hunger, immigration, whatever the issue we sort of put at the forefront, the root causes of all those issues are, of course, capitalist profit making. And the billionaires who run the country are not really thinking about changing those policies because they're benefiting them. And I think knowing that, they know the level of resistance is going to grow. So you've seen the rise of cop cities all around the United States, which are these giant training facilities for police agencies to come together from not only around the United States, but around the world, from the IDF to the UK to wherever. The main sort of one that has sort of gone maybe a little bit viral internationally is in Atlanta, just this massive training facility. But I think there's something like 35 all around the country. So you've got the police becoming increasingly militarized, increasing their militaristic type training, and also then increasing both nationally and globally their interactions with each other to further strengthen the repressive forces. We've seen a huge increase in laws. They call them quote unquote critical infrastructure laws. But basically it just means like if you do a nonviolent protest at a pipeline, that they can then charge you typically it was like you'd be charged like a felony or something for trespassing. Maybe someone would cut a pipeline, but no one got injured, just trying to save the planet. But now it'll be like heavy felonies, like you killed someone if you take significant climate action. And we've seen in different places, and dozens of states are passing these. So, in addition to NSA spying, which has a longer sort of piece to it, in addition to what we've seen in terms of thought control as it concerns the issue of social media companies, now we have Donald Trump as the president who spent his entire campaign saying, we're going to root out, and it has kind of two elements to it. I mean, one, heavily increasing repression against the working class by attacking immigrants. And I think it's not often presented that way. And in the mainstream, it's presented as if, this is just some crusade or whatever to keep America safe and to secure the border. But I think really we have to look, and we're talking about repression, at the attacks on immigrants as just that, as a huge form of repression, a design to divide, to scare, to drive into the shadows elements of the working class, to make it so that people who employ immigrants can make more money by dividing people against each other. And that is going to increase. And that's going to increase the level of oppression in society significantly, because it means that they're going to be out more. There's a law in Congress right now that may or may not pass that's designed to help at the local and state level, to help them work closer with ICE, to override some of the laws that localities have put in, ICE being the immigration service in the United States, and so on and so forth. So like that element is guaranteed to increase. And then Trump spent the entire campaign saying we're going to root out the socialists, the communists, the quote unquote terrorists. He was talking about deporting students here in this country who spoke up for Palestine. So, as Maya Angelou said, you got to believe people when they tell you who they are the first time. So we don't know exactly what Trump is going to do. And the point you made, Fiona, is very well taken. I mean, the congressional hearing around that Breakthrough News was mentioned in was about a Palestine demonstration and an attempt to present a Palestine demonstration as like a terrorist action, and saying that all of these groups and individuals, people should be tried, they should be shut down, organizations should be stripped of their nonprofit status so they're not able to raise money in the same way. And I think we can expect, or should expect, that they will carry this out, because it's of a piece with the deeper, broader bipartisan reality that we've seen over the past decade, which is that when the people in power know they're not going to solve the problems that people are desperately suffering under, they understand that ultimately people at some point will rise up and fight back, and they're preparing themselves in every possible way, A, by generally strengthening the repressive apparatus, and B, by directly targeting activists, organizations, media entities, or whatever it may be that can act as rallying points for resistance to the billionaire agenda, because that's what Trump is really about, is the agenda of the richest people in the United States and Europe and other parts of the globe.
Looking at the reasons why Trump is back in the White House, though, it seems that the obvious explanation, and you sort of touched upon that, is that it's the economy, Stuart. Biden presided over a spiraling cost of living crisis as his administration doubled down on a global war drive, leaving much of the US population struggling to pay their bills as living standards declined. Trump has promised to revive the US economy and has campaigned on two key areas that affect foreign policy. The first is ending the war in Ukraine, and the second is tariffs, particularly targeting China. Can you speak to the reality of these two promises? What is your assessment of Trump's ability to revive the US economy, and what are the possible consequences of this globally?
Great question. And I'll just start with saying I don't think that Trump has much of a chance to revive the economy, at least not to the level that he's saying. And I think to the extent it even happens, how much his policies will be responsible is also, an open question. I mean, you look at what Trump is proposing, and he's saying, for instance, he's going to have these huge tax cuts, which are obviously just giveaways for the richest people. But the way it's presented to people is like, yes, it's going to supercharge economic growth. But if you look at the actual projections about what the impact on the economy would be of at least Trump's proposed tax cuts, we'll see what happens when they actually put it in place. But I think that's a rough guide. It's less than 1% increase in GDP over the entirety of the 4 years of his administration. It's less than 600,000 jobs created over the entirety net jobs of his administration. And he's also talking about we're going to use tariffs to push forward manufacturing. Well, he used tariffs in the first term, and over that 4 years, it was only about 360,000 net jobs created in manufacturing. He talks about the golden age of manufacturing in America. 1979 was the year that had the highest manufacturing jobs in the US, about 19 million people. Now you've about 12 million people working in manufacturing. So you need to create, 6, 7 million jobs to get to that level. And we're talking about best case scenario. I looked into this a little earlier in the year, and I tried to be like as fair as I could be. Like, what Trump was proposing, what the infrastructure bill and some of the other stuff that was done during Biden's administration that's supposed to bring jobs in, it's basically impossible to imagine, in my view, adding even 1 million jobs net in the 4 years. But even if it was 2 or 3 million, it would not be at the level of the manufacturing renaissance. But that being said, there's actually no person who's predicting that. I mean, they're predicting basically in the hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs. So in terms of the tax cuts, in terms of the tariffs, in terms of all these things, they're not actually, when you model them out, promoting any significant increase in GDP, any significant increase in jobs. And then, of course, who even knows if the projections, which, tend to be relatively fair, but anything can happen in terms of the economy. So it could be worse than what's even projected. It could be better, but even then, would it really change the trajectory of the economy in the United States? I don't think so whatsoever. And then you also look at a lot of Trump's policies. I mean, a huge amount of Trump's policies are about reducing people's income. And so as much as he says we're going to bring down grocery prices, although it's worth noting that he said that during the campaign, then after he wins, he does an interview, maybe with CNN, maybe with 60 Minutes. I can't remember, but they were just like, so are you going to bring down grocery prices? And he said, well, I can't promise anything. So even after he gets elected, he himself is saying, yeah, I don't know what's really going to happen. But you look at so much of what Trump is pushing. I mean, one key issue is around labor rights. And, obviously forming a union, and a union is the best way to increase your own wages. All of Trump's proposals and all of his friends and all of the people they're putting in. And in fact, his labor secretary, who they're pretending is a pro working class person, has just been meeting with McDonald's, by the way, and a number of other Fortune 500 companies to talk about some of the rules. And some of this is kind of like inside baseball American labor law, but one of them is like the joint employer rule. And that basically just means that, like, most McDonald's are franchises. They're not owned by the corporation. And so a lot of franchisees, even though they're making a lot of money, are like, well, we can't pay you a living wage because we're not McDonald's. We're just like a small private business. Now, that in and of itself is kind of fake, but nonetheless, McDonald's controls everything. Every McDonald's is the same. So the overall McDonald's corporation should be responsible for making sure every employee has a living wage. So the joint employer rule just basically means that the huge international Fortune 500 McDonald's that's all around the world is also responsible for the wages of the workers in the United States at the franchises. And so then it would be very easy for them to pay people a living wage. So Donald Trump wants to prevent that from happening. They want to reduce overtime pay. There's so many different aspects of it. I could go on and on and on. But in addition to his proposals, from tax cuts to tariffs, not modeling out to create any significant economic growth, he also is promoting labor policies that are designed to actually reduce people's wages and income. Not only that, by driving this aggressive anti-immigrant policy, the reality is they're not going to deport 12 to 15 million people. It's not going to happen. The U.S. economy would collapse. In Texas, for instance, 50% of all construction workers are undocumented. And that's just an estimate. Could be more than that. Now, if you go to Texas now, you will see in all the major cities, they're building a lot of things. So do Elon Musk, do Apple, does Facebook, does ExxonMobil, does Chevron, do all these big companies want all their buildings to not be built? Do they want their giant mansions not to make it? Do they want to not be able to put in their nice Olympic-sized pool in the giant new mansion they're buying in the huge thing outside of Austin that they've just purchased as they've moved all their business from California? I don't think so. So the upshot of that is they're going to deport as many people as they can, but really they're going to create an atmosphere of total fear. That's they're going to attempt to. We'll see. I think people will push back so that there'll be more people deeper in the shadows who won't speak up about wages, won't speak up about working conditions, and that'll also bring down wages and benefits for the American worker. So even though Trump, I thought, had a very good way of presenting it in a way that made it appear as if he was speaking more directly than Biden was, who's Biden and Harris were saying the economy was great. I think when you really dig into it, it actually could get worse for workers in the United States of America. I think the economy will stay probably at best the same, if not get worse, depending on a range of other factors. But nonetheless, this kind of demagogic approach by Trump has been politically effective in terms of allowing him to get elected.
Really, really useful analysis there, Eugene. And I think, the fact that we have a billionaire in the White House should tell you all you need to know really about how positive this agenda is going to be for ordinary working people in the United States. I thought that was a really fascinating breakdown that you gave us there. Just moving on to a really big issue that's come up last week is the ceasefire deal in Gaza, agreed after 15 months of a devastating US-Israeli genocide. How can we make sense of this development? And what's your assessment of the balance of forces in the region following all the atrocities that we've witnessed over the last 15 months?
Well, I think what we're seeing here is sort of a culmination of the US strategy from the beginning. I mean, when you really look at what took place with the genocide in Gaza and, the escalation in the West Bank and everything happening in occupied Palestine with this offensive by the Israelis, the United States had, in my view, not an exact identity of interest with Israel, but it had an identity of interest with Israel. And I think, the only way in a way to make sense of what the US strategy was is to connect it to the pivot to Asia, the so-called pivot to Asia that Obama put forward, basically containing China and shifting the US military focus there. Now, of course, since the mid 1970s, the vast majority of the US military, at least since the late 1970s, has been focused towards the Persian Gulf, Middle East, West Asia area, obviously because that is not only the crossroads of global commerce, but the center of or at least at that time, the center of the oil trade, and maybe even more importantly, not just the oil trade in general, where the vast majority of oil for Asia goes, which is, of course, the rising economic powers of the world, really starting around the same time, and even more so in the past 10 or 20 years. So obviously, the way Obama laid it out was, if we want to actually confront China, we can't do everything at once. So if we view China as the biggest threat to the unipolar rule of the world by the United States, we got to disengage from the Middle East. But they can't just randomly disengage because they're not engaged for some random reason. They're engaged because they don't want there to be any sort of independent powers in the region that can use their sort of geostrategic reality to, improve their own countries, elevate their own position in the world order, whatever it may be, to basically just reduce the total access to the region and total control of the region that the US has been trying to maintain for quite some time. So obviously, to do that, they had to pursue what Obama and what Trump and others had continued, and Biden had continued, which was to try to find some way to create a balance of power to keep the Western-based interest in the driver's seat there in that region. And of course, Israel sold itself to the West when it created itself exactly that way. It has functioned as, some people say it's like an aircraft carrier on land. I mean, it is the guarantor of Western imperial interest in that region. So to create some sort of alliance anchored on Israel in order to be able to make sure that countries like Iran or, any other Arab country that would decide to have some level of sovereignty and switch their position, that nobody could find a way to sort of push the West out, right? So ultimately, that's what led to normalization, all these different sort of pieces. I mean, in many ways, that's what the Iran deal was actually about under Obama, was creating kind of like a cold peace between an Israel-Saudi kind of bloc, is what I think Obama was hoping for. Then you had the normalization, kind of the same thing under Trump and under Biden as well. But nonetheless, the main roadblock to actually carrying this out is the Palestinian struggle, because the masses of people in West Asia do not want to see the Palestinian struggle totally erased. They want to see justice for Palestine, and that has the opportunity to disrupt the entire process of normalization, and that's what happened on October 7th. So for the United States, you have this situation where for them, I think it was right and perfect, even though this is so terrible to think that someone would think like this, but I think this is how they think, for Israel to wage this genocidal war, because it was addressing their biggest issue, which was that they couldn't really fully complete this normalization process without erasing the Palestinian cause. So ultimately, their hope, I think, was this will be an opportunity to totally erase the Palestinian movement, to totally erase all of the Palestinian factions, to impose upon the Palestinians, the US view of like a colonial style, quote unquote, peace. And I think in a Machiavellian way, I think the US was also hoping that this would dent Israel's reputation and also make Israel more dependent on the United States, which again further helps them shape the environment the way they want to shape the environment in the Middle East, in balancing between all the various different interests. So Biden, I think that's why he went along with this. I mean, everyone is saying, oh, well, Biden just didn't want to use his leverage to stop the genocide in Gaza. I mean, he obviously didn't want to use his leverage, but I don't think it's just because he was like bad or weak or whatever. I think it's because he felt like, yes, this is good. Like, we need to keep this going because it'll help our agenda. Now, we've gotten all this way, and I think Trump about to come into office can see that ultimately it's not working out exactly the way they wanted it to work out. And that in some senses, yes, they have succeeded in shifting things in the region in a way that I think can potentially make things slightly more favorable. And I'll come to that in a second. But ultimately, they cannot crush the Palestinian people. The Israelis were totally unable to destroy the Palestinian resistance despite having all of the resources in the world. So there's really not that much more, I think, that Trump and the broader US foreign policy establishment felt like they could get out of this, and that they better make a deal now before things start to shift somehow in the other direction. And who knows how that could be, but the longer this goes on, the more inflamed the conflict becomes, the more the unintended, sort of unexpected aspects of the solidarity movement with Palestinians around the world could shift different things. If you make the peace now, you've got to sit, or a so-called peace, ceasefire, whatever you want to call it. Syria has fallen, and that was a country that was, whatever one might say about it, was opposed to the U.S. agenda broadly in the region. Iran is a little bit on the back foot and having, its own internal issues as well. Iraq, there's some turmoil there in terms of what's going to happen with the various different forces that are more opposed to the U.S. agenda. Lebanon, obviously, sort of similar sort of issue. So you've got a situation where they might not have everything they want, but they're able to perhaps do more to shape the region to make it easier to disengage a little bit from the Middle East. They might have a more reliable, pliable government in Syria. They may have a little more calm in the Lebanon front. Iran, maybe they can work a deal, or, at the very least, they may have to take a little bit of a step back and be a little bit more open to making deals with the West because, they have their own issues and their own troubles. Iraq, we don't know exactly what's going to happen there, but they may be able to shift the politics a little bit in that regard. All these different sort of pieces that I think come into this. Now is the opportunity, perhaps, even if they can't push the Abraham Accords or normalization that much further, at least they can have enough of a modus vivendi in terms of feeling like they are shaping things that it will facilitate the broader goal of moving forward. Hence why they were willing to, tell the Israelis, like, okay, now's the time. Like, I don't think Netanyahu or anyone else was chomping at the bit to stop the genocide. But the U.S. said, you know what? Now's the time. We got what we needed to get out of this, or as much as we could get out of this. Now we need to switch to a new modality if we want to continue our same basic thing. So that's my general feeling, about sort of why this is happening now, because I think the overall objective of the United States in West Asia right now, vis-a-vis the Palestinian struggle, is to find a way to disengage more from the region by creating a more stable status quo for Western powers. And I think they feel they've reached that point to the best they can right now. And now they want to move forward and move on and pursue their sort of broader goal, which I think will be to continue to try to shift more towards confronting China. And that's a big conversation when you look at some of the people, Elbridge Colby, all these other people, who's going to be the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy, who they're bringing in, who are 100% against China. And they have this view that the U.S. has to make hard choices. So that's why a lot of them say we got to wind down the war in Ukraine. Same thing with the Middle East. Like, we can't be deeply involved in these wars in West Asia. It's taking our eye off the ball of really slowing down China. And I think that's why Trump was willing to move aggressively at this moment, because they were able to get, some victories. I mean, I think for the imperialists, the fall of Assad is a victory for them because a roadblock, whatever the contradictions, is gone. I think the fact that Hezbollah, which, I think the world feels fought very bravely, but obviously took some big hits, and the internal situation in Lebanon, things are sort of turning more in that direction, that was a victory for them, even if Hezbollah is not destroyed in any way, shape, or form, if they had to take a little bit of a step back. Obviously, the Palestinian people are going to have to rebuild and continue to do things, so they're not destroyed, but they're going to be also focused very much on rebuilding their society and internally. Iran, Iraq, all these different places. I think there's a kind of doom and gloom among some people, and I think that makes sense, that Israel's doing whatever they want. The U.S. is winning everything. I don't think that's exactly the case. I think that they're making this deal now because they're fearful the balance of power that makes them look so victorious now could potentially shift in dangerous ways if the genocide was ongoing.
It's a really interesting insights there, Eugene. And you did call me out on my doom and gloom. You sort of put me in a roller coaster there. But turning to a very important region that you have also extensively written and reported on, the African continent, we have seen a momentous rise in anti-colonial sentiment in the Sahel region in recent years, rebelling against Western imperialist powers. As of January 2025, 6 African countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, Senegal, and Ivory Coast, have cut military ties with France. What factors, in your opinion, are allowing the move towards sovereignty at this moment, and what are the wider geopolitical implications?
I think what's really driving the anti-neocolonial wave in Africa is that there's a generational shift happening on the continent. And people who know China know that the Chinese always said that they lived in 100 years of humiliation prior to the revolution in 1949 and divided by imperialism, colonized, semi-colonized. Africa is basically living in 500 years of humiliation, from the slave trade to colonialism to neocolonialism. I mean, despite being, what's the richest continent? I don't know. But, obviously one of the centers of all global wealth, Africa remains the center of all global poverty. Almost all the poorest countries on earth are in Africa. And I think that what you're seeing also in Africa now is, I think it's about 70% of the population on the continent is under 35. And many countries, it's even more than that. Like in Niger, I think you've got close to 50% of the country is under 15. I was recently in Niger. It's a very young country. But anyway, anyone who travels to Africa on a regular basis will tell you this. Every African country, it's mainly young people. I mean, if you look at Kenya, the Gen Z uprising, young people. We could go on and on and on. But ultimately, the basic point I'm making is I think that there is a generation of Africans who have seen their parents, their grandparents, sometimes their great-grandparents, the stories they've heard, living in total abject poverty, having no real access to resources and opportunity, despite living on top of great wealth. And they can look to the future. Like that's, young people tend to be the center of all major transformative social change for that reason, because you're looking forward with a lot of life left and you're thinking like, yeah, I don't want my life to be terrible. And I think a growing number, a significant number of Africans are looking at the future, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, thinking I could live another 80 years. And I do not want to live like the past 2 or 3 generations of people who I have seen in my own family. And we have to change the trajectory of what is taking place on the continent. And so what you're seeing now is a major rhetorical shift. Like even the most neo-colonial leaders in Africa are like, we're for Pan-Africanism. We want to eliminate poverty. We want to do this. We want to do that. So there's really no African leader, no matter how neo-colonial their actual policies are, that is willing to speak in that way. Almost everyone is looking to speak in a way that is speaking to this aspiration of the African youth. And that's why I think you can see how powerful it is, because every single leader knows that they could be swept away at any time by a broad youth movement. And I think in Francophone Africa, part of the reason why it's kicking off to the same degree is because all of the African countries in many ways are subject to neocolonialism. But the former French colonies, it's so in your face. I mean, you have the CFA franc, like they control their currency. And I don't want to get deep into the CFA franc because it's getting deep into the weeds. But the most important thing to understand is it basically ties these countries' economies to the EU, not just France. It used to be just France. Now, because of the euro, it's the entire Eurozone, and makes them a very favorable investment location for the Eurozone. But the CFA franc also incentivizes you never investing in the country and taking all of your money out. So it also acts in such a way that it only facilitates imports. It prevents you from industrializing your country, from developing different services, from having good tax revenue, all of these various different things. In addition to the fact that the French also have their troops there. I mean, there's the language issue. More people in Africa speak French than France. One interesting fact people might want to know, the largest French-speaking urban area on earth is Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's not Paris. So, ultimately, I say that because if you know anything about the French language, you know that France has like a very strong hold on it. And they have this like academy that every year is like, this is the only official French language. You had the issue that took place during the Olympics where there's a performer, a singer, I believe she's Senegalese, who is one of the more famous singers in France. And people were like, she should perform at the Olympics. And Macron was like, no. And the reason why was he said she doesn't speak real French, because she's using slang. And I'm sorry to say that even many of the left parties in France agreed with him on that. So you can see the like level of just extreme racism, even at that level, is so palpable, so in your face on so many different fronts that I think this is why it's breaking out in such a powerful way in Francophone Africa. I think there's other factors as well with the Sahel. Also, the conflicts there, I think, drove a lot of dissatisfaction in ways that were deeply acute because so many people were dying, so many parts of the country were under siege. There are so many different challenges. In the Sahel, most people believe that France and the US and other countries are complicit in that violence, that they're actually using terrorism as an excuse to continue to militarize and control their countries. So there are some other factors that were there that I think also helped target it, but like Nigeria also has a big problem with internal conflicts, and you didn't see the exact same thing. And so I think just the reality of the neo-colonial presence of France and how in your face it is partially why we're seeing that kick off. But now we're seeing it spread. I already mentioned the Gen Z uprising in Kenya. I mean, Nigeria did have a big round of protest towards the end of last year. Interestingly enough, they were the biggest in northern Nigeria, which is bordering Niger. They looked the same, a lot of people carrying Russian flags and things like that, which is, also in and of itself like a middle finger to the West. People are not dumb. They understand like, okay, Russia, it seems to be the number one enemy of the West right now. So we're trying to send a message. So we're going to, say like, yeah, we'd rather work with Russia than America. Like that is a message that people are sending, and they know that it's a conscious message. It's not that they're like dupes of Putin or something like that. They're trying to make it clear who they are and that they want independence, they want real sovereignty, and that Africans will partner with whoever they want to partner with. So you can see now, even Cote d'Ivoire, which is 100% pro-French, that's a total sham. I mean, they might be getting rid of the soldiers, but that's just because they don't want to get wiped away. I mean, Alassane Ouattara, who is the head president, was brought into power by a French-backed military coup where like he had a military drive of people with the French Air Force and Army like helping him massacre people along the way. But nonetheless, he can see what's happening. You can see the writing on the wall. I think the same is true in a number of these countries. And interestingly enough, now France is having to work more with Kenya and Nigeria, these Anglophone countries, because in the Francophone countries it's becoming too dangerous. Chad, that's a little more complex what's happening in Chad, I think. But nonetheless, you could also a country that's like not known for being against France, that has good relations, but it's just not sustainable. Senegal has its own contradictions, but I think is more in the sort of anti-neocolonial side. Certainly the mass movement, that is a little bit more in line with what we're seeing in the Sahel. But I think you can see pretty consistently across the continent that the young people there are just not going to live in another generation of total poverty and deprivation. And just like the people of China started to rise up across the 1930s, really, let's say starting in 1911, right? And the early Republican Revolution and Sun Yat-sen. And, it took a while for it to form up, but then in 1949, they took the country back. And I think this is a similar period in Africa as what we saw there in China from that like 1911 to 1949 period, where people are starting to rise up, take their country back, demand more sovereignty, a lot of contradictions on a range of different fronts. But the broad thrust and the broad arc of it is that people are trying to take back what's theirs, establish sovereignty in neocolonialism, and have relations with every country on earth. Like I've traveled all across Africa. People are angry at Western policies, but they have no problem. They want to work with Europe. They want to work with China. They want to work with India, with Turkey, with America. They just want to have the right to choose the best situation to improve their country, to create more access to resources and opportunities, and lift themselves up out of poverty. And they're going to do what it takes to reclaim it.
Brilliant. Well, that's a really inspiring, sweeping analysis of the region. But of course, the Western powers, we know from history, they're not going to accept the loss of their colonial advantages in the face of the rise of these movements for independence and sovereignty without a fight. So in terms of US influence in the region, there are reports of AFRICOM expanding there, although they were expelled from Niger, for example, in September 2024. So could you clarify the dynamics at play here? Can we expect the empire to strike back? And what can progressive forces do across the world to oppose Western interference in the region and build a solidarity movement?
I'm really glad you asked that question because yes, the empire definitely is already in moving to strike back. And you can see like France, for instance, is now kind of shifting their whole sort of way of acting and basically saying like, we want to have kind of a smaller footprint, basically so it doesn't look as bad. And so they're looking for new partners, and they're mainly looking now, I think, at Anglophone countries to be some of these partners, although some of the Francophone countries will stay with them. But you can see they're talking more with Kenya, may actually host the Africa-France summit and I think 2027, maybe 2026. They're looking at Nigeria, where they've been doing military drills with the military there and then the potentiality of being there. But France is basically saying what we want to do is reduce our military presence, shift it around a little bit so that it's in places that are more friendly to us and maybe a little bit more out of the way, but that we want to increase the ideological offensive against Pan-Africanism. And, in France, they have something called the School of Economic Warfare, which is one of those French, I don't speak French, but what do they call them? Écoles. It's one of the top schools there for the military and for the government rather. And so they basically train people in how to wage economic warfare, right? You think about hybrid wars. So they obviously have the military academies for the actual soldiers, but then they also have this, how do we undermine countries in different ways? And they've already put out a white paper that was almost book length that essentially is saying that the real challenge is that there is a growing, radical, really anti-neocolonial, but anti-imperialist Pan-African movement. And it's, many different shades. Some of them are socialists and communists. Some of them are just people who want more sovereignty, but that people, whatever their ideological predilection exactly may be, are growing increasingly united around more sovereignty, less neocolonialism, and a strong anti-imperial stance for African countries. And that the most important thing is to create a stronger ideological front against that. And you can see on multiple levels, that they go out of their way in France to try to cultivate this on multiple different fronts. You can look at the United States with AFRICOM. The United States has always kept kind of a lower profile on the African continent in the past, let's say 20 years in many different ways, principally just because U.S. military presence is so, people know what that means to such a degree, and they're aware that Africans are very conscious about colonialism and neocolonialism. So, the U.S., I think, has always been a little worried. AFRICOM was never able to even establish a headquarters in Africa. Not that they weren't working there, but no country wanted to be known as the place with the U.S. military because it's just so clear what that represents. So, they have the drone base in Niger, but it was in the middle of nowhere and it was secret. And it was only when Nick Turse, writing at The Intercept, revealed it by actually looking at data from people's fitness watches. So, just remember, you're always being watched by all these things that you have. Then it became known, but people didn't know. It was only because of the work done by individuals with Pan-African TV, the Socialist Movement of Ghana and others in Ghana, who were able to find out that the US has this private airport terminal in Ghana where you can come and go from the country without going through customs. People didn't really know about that. In Zambia, progressive forces like the Socialist Party of Zambia, who've been able to reveal more, that Zambia is becoming more of a base. But they've been trying to keep it a little bit under wraps already. And so that's still the continuation. But I say all that just to say that you can see the kind of creeping militarization that's happening. They're doing more drills with Zambia. They have this justified accord exercise in East Africa, Horn of Africa, that happens every year. Kenya is going to be a big host. That was when Ruto went to DC and they became a major non-NATO ally. That was one of the things they agreed on. But one element of this, and believe it or not, guys, the military never responded to me when I reached out to them about this. But one of the last justified accord exercises, one of the areas they were doing it in, because it's multiple countries, was Somaliland. It's not a country, but they claim to be a country. It's the northern part of Somalia. And Somaliland, since it wants to be recognized as a country, has been saying to the US and the UK, you should put a military base here. You should recognize us and we'll host a military base. And we're better than Djibouti because Djibouti has a Chinese base. And you can't trust them because if you're working with China, they can't be trusted. So you want to be in Somaliland. So they're already doing sort of secret basing, the US and the UK, over there in Somaliland. They've obviously got a big base in Djibouti, Camp Lemonnier. They're looking to do various different factors in various different ways to sort of manipulate this. You can see they're trying to cultivate Angola as an ally now, traditionally one of the more independent countries in Africa in many different ways. They already have traditional security relationships with many others. So you can see that there's a shifting sands happening in terms of the military. The AFRICOM and now the Central Command, which is the one that is basically West Asia, are now working very closely together. I think AFRICOM is now officially under Central Command. And in a way, it made it look like they were drawing back AFRICOM. But what it really means is it actually brings even more troops into AFRICOM, because it means that the broader sort of US presence in Europe and in West Asia is now also going to be heavily focused on Africa. The EU is making some other interesting moves. Like when Chad got rid of the French, interesting to note who they brought in. They didn't bring in Russia, like Mali and Burkina Faso and others. They brought in Hungary and they brought in Turkey. to NATO countries. So like what, gives you a sense of what that's about. Looks better than France, but same basic agenda. And Hungary actually has been talking a lot about this. That's maybe something we could talk about later, the far right in Europe and how they're relating to these changes in Africa, which is notable. But I say all that to say that militarily, they're shifting their posture, but they're actually in some ways strengthening it and also trying to make it even more subterranean. But those military relationships are how they really build ties on the continent, because they basically say to these regimes, we'll give you money and guns and weapons and our own military to suppress your own people and keep you in power. So that's happening. And at the French level, there's a major increase in terms of sort of quote unquote soft power. At the American level, the same thing is also happening. You've got these things like the Mandela Scholars set up under Obama, which is designed to create, friendly African leaders. The National Endowment for Democracy, which is, as they themselves have said, we do what the CIA used to do, become a major funder of media in Africa. And this is like popping up all over the continent, these like independent media. And, so it's Western trained mainly, but sometimes African trained people who want to be journalists, who want to do the news, but, need funds and resources. They're cultivating those people and helping them put all sorts of independent media out there. A lot of interesting work has been done on that by Roscoe Palm. Some of that you can see at Monthly Review. Very interesting. In South Africa, the U.S. Embassy has a monthly off the record meeting called On the Rocks, where they bring all the editors of all the top media to a bar, and it's an open bar, and you just have drinks and talk. We're just hanging out. Nothing nefarious, of course, going on there. They're just hanging out. But you can see the soft power level is increasing as well. So, I think that there's a lot of fear about this in the imperial capitals. I think it's bigger in Europe than it is in America. America has a lot of trade with Africa, but it's not that much. Africa's main trading partners are the EU and China, really, and then Asia more broadly. And the US does do trade with them, but it's not as significant. So the US role is more about helping Europe maintain its role. In addition to, yes, the US has its own interests, but you could even see in Niger, the US actually tried to play France, and France was complaining about that, because as soon as they were like, we're kicking out France, America starts sending all these delegations, and they're like, hey, we want to stay. If you want to kick out France, cool with us. Now, it ended up not working because America was so arrogant. The Nigerian military was like, okay, well, if you want to stay, you got to play by our rules. And they're like, well, we're not going to do that. So like, you got to go. But you could see they were even trying to get over a little bit on France, in that regard. So for Europe, it's more of an existential crisis, what's happening in Africa. For America, I think it's negative and it's not good for imperialism. But I think they're hoping they might be able to massage it a little bit more, and they can be a little bit more pliable than I think Europe can be in terms of trying to counter China, especially on the African continent. So anyway, long story short, I think people around the world have to just be very much in solidarity with what is happening in the Sahel. There's contradictions for sure. There's always contradictions. But ultimately, what's happening in the Sahel is of critical importance, because the Sahel is breaking free of neocolonialism in a way that is profound and I think real. And whatever the contradictions may be, it's the first kind of break in the dam in a major way on the continent in this century to start to change the trajectory away from Africa being totally impoverished. I think people have to be very much on the lookout about demonization. Eritrea, Zimbabwe, countries like that have stood up to the West and that have pursued their own developmental course with much more success than they are given in the mainstream media, continue to be under attack and under sanctions and lied about. And I think that people who care about lifting Africa out of poverty, opposing imperialism and neocolonialism, have to stand with those countries as well. And I think the mass movements that are happening in other places under the guise of Pan-Africanism, need more solidarity, need more support, need more amplification all around the world, because, they're fighting under very, very difficult, challenging circumstances, as it were. But I think regardless of all the various contradictions, I think the forces who can stand with this broad trajectory, it's critically important that we do this, especially in the global north, because that's, who the main enemy is for the African people.
Thank you. That's both maybe inspiring, and I'm really scared now. I do have a smartwatch, but then I realized that my smartwatch is Huawei, and maybe China doesn't care that much about me. So they've got a lot of people to worry about. So I think I'm good. But let's focus in a little bit now.